It's so true. And, today is the 900th anniversary of what I like to call a sort of the mixture between Titanic and Game of Thrones, because this one ship goes down with the only possible male heir to the throne. And it throws England into complete chaos for 15 years, and then a total anarchy for 19 years. And at the end of it, all because the prince, the king's only legitimate son, dies in this tragic shipwreck where we have one man's eyewitness account, a butcher on board who watched the ship go down. It's all because of that we end up with the Plantagenets on the throne for 350 years before the Tudors bumped them off.
None of it was real. Not the numbers, not the transactions, not the institutions listed on the letterhead. And Spenser, trying to protect the sister he loved, had helped make the whole thing happen. London, the 21st of October, 2020. Inside a converted study at Althorpe House, a man in his 50s sits alone with a manila envelope he has waited 25 years to open. He does not know it yet, but the documents inside will end a broadcasting career, force a public apology from the world's most trusted news organization, and reopen a wound the British monarchy believed had finally closed. His name is Charles Spenser, the 9th Earl of that name. And in less than an hour, he is going to discover that the most consequential conversation of his sister's life was built on a lie someone handed him personally in a private meeting 25 years earlier. He slides the papers out. Freedom of Information documents, released only after a 5-year legal fight that dragged through multiple appeals.
It was my turn to get up there, and I'd been a broadcaster, so I knew how to speak, I thought, but it was very different to do that on behalf of my sister in front of 1.5 billion people, or whatever it was. And then very early on, I tripped over a word, and I remember thinking, that was a real wake-up call to me. I thought, no, you've got to get this right. And then I think I probably just read off, rather than looking around and doing what you're meant to do. I just thought, right, I've got to get to this. And then by the end, I was completely wrung out emotionally, and I couldn't breathe.
Internal BBC correspondence, some of it heavily redacted. Graphic design files with timestamps from the autumn of 1995. A digital trail that was never supposed to resurface, buried deep enough that an entire generation of journalists had come and gone believing the matter closed. Spenser reads the first page standing up. By the third, he has sat back down because his legs will not hold him. The bank statements were fake. The ones a journalist named Martin Bashir had shown him in September of 1995, spread across a table between them, official-looking, precise, convincing. The ones that suggested his sister's own staff were being paid to spy on her private life. The ones that opened a door Spenser had no idea, at the time, he was even holding the key to. He sets the papers down on the desk and stares at the far wall for a long moment. Outside, the grounds of Althorpe stretch out exactly as they always have, 13,000 acres of parkland his family has held for 5 centuries. None of that inheritance, none of that history, prepares a man for this particular kind of reckoning. Not a threat from outside the family. A mistake from inside it, one he made himself, sitting across a table from a journalist he trusted at exactly the wrong moment. He thinks back, inevitably, to that room in September of 1995. The documents Bashir had spread across the table between them. The calm, methodical way he had walked Spenser through each page, letting the numbers do the persuading rather than his own words.
Well, the irony is that I met Martin Bashir on the 31st of August, 1995, because exactly 2 years later she died. And I do draw a line between the two events. It's quite clear from the introduction that I sat in on the 19th of September 1995, everyone was going to be made untrustworthy. And I think that Diana did lose trust in really key people. This is a young girl in her mid-30s who has lived this extraordinarily turbulent and difficult time in the public eye. She didn't know who to trust, and in the end, when she died 2 years later, she was without any form of real protection.
Spenser remembers asking very few questions that day. He remembers, mostly, the feeling of dread settling over him as each new page seemed to confirm the last. 25 years is a long time to carry a decision you didn't know you were making badly. What exactly had Bashir shown him in that meeting, and why had it worked so completely on a man who had every reason to be careful? Why had it taken the BBC a quarter of a century to admit publicly what one freelance graphic designer already knew the night the interview first aired? And what would this discovery ultimately cost an institution that had spent decades protecting its own reputation over the truth sitting quietly in its own archive? Spenser had not gone looking for these documents in a vacuum. Questions about the interview's origins had circulated in journalistic circles for years, resurfacing periodically and then fading again each time the BBC declined to comment further. What made 2020 different was persistence, a legal filing pursued not by a newspaper but by Spenser's own representatives, forcing the corporation, under the law, to finally release records it had successfully kept sealed for a quarter of a century. It had taken 5 years of appeals to get this envelope onto his desk. Most people, faced with that kind of institutional resistance, would have given up long before now. Spenser had not. To understand what Charles Spenser was holding in that study in October of 2020, you have to go back much further than 1995. You have to go back to a princess who had already been betrayed by hidden microphones twice before anyone ever forged a single document in her name. The first time it happened, nobody even knew her voice was being recorded.
Well, it gave everybody a wonderful new label. It's Diana's unstable and Diana's mentally imbalanced. And unfortunately, that seems to have stuck on and off over the years.
Are you saying that that label stuck within your marriage?
I think people used it and it stuck. Yes.
According to press reports, it was suggested that it was around this time things became so difficult that you actually tried to injure yourself. Is that true?
When no one listens to you, or you feel no one's listening to you, all sorts of things start to happen. For instance, you have so much pain inside yourself that you try and hurt yourself on the outside.
It was New Year's Eve, 1989. A retired bank manager named Cyril Renan sat alone in his home in Abingdon with a radio scanner, the kind of hobbyist equipment enthusiasts used at the time to pick up stray signals bleeding off the early analog mobile phone network. What crossed his receiver that night was a private, intimate conversation between Diana, Princess of Wales, and a close friend named James Gilby, a man who had known her since childhood. Renan held onto the recording. By his own later account, he didn't fully grasp what he had captured, and the tape sat largely untouched for well over a year before it made its way into the hands of a national newspaper. In August of 1992, The Sun published the story under the name Squidgygate, a name drawn from the affectionate nickname Gilby used for Diana throughout the call. The recording ran nearly 40 minutes. The paper published an edited 30-minute transcript, judging the remaining 10 minutes too explicit for print, and even set up a premium phone line so tens of thousands of callers could listen to portions of the actual tape for themselves, at 36p a minute. The public heard Diana speaking with a level of unguarded honesty no one outside her closest circle had ever witnessed. Her fear, her loneliness inside the marriage, a sense of having given everything to an institution that gave almost nothing back. It confirmed, in her own voice, what insiders had only ever whispered. She had not consented to any of it. She had simply been overheard by a stranger with hobbyist equipment, and within months the entire country had been given a front row seat to a conversation she believed was hers alone. For Diana, the discovery that her most private words had been sold by the minute to strangers was not an abstract violation. It was intimate, specific, and permanent. There was no retracting it. No newspaper apology could put those 30 minutes back behind closed doors. She had to walk into public engagements the following week knowing that tens of thousands of people had paid to listen to her fear and her loneliness, one phone call at a time, for the price of a cup of tea. The palace's response, at the time, was to say almost nothing at all. No formal statement addressing the content. No acknowledgement of the clear violation of her privacy. Just silence, the same institutional silence Diana would come to describe, years later, as one of the defining features of life inside the royal family. problems were not discussed. They were simply absorbed, and the person at the center of them was expected to carry on as though nothing had happened. Questions about how, exactly, both tapes had been obtained persisted for years afterward, and were never fully resolved. Some analysts who examined the recordings raised technical concerns about inconsistencies in how the audio had supposedly been captured, suggesting the full story behind both leaks may have been more complicated than the simple account of an amateur radio hobbyist stumbling onto a signal by chance. A member of Parliament sitting on an intelligence oversight committee at the time noted publicly that the leaks strengthened the case for greater scrutiny of the security services, and questioned openly whether elements within Britain's intelligence apparatus might have played some role in how the recordings came to exist in the first place. No definitive answer to that question has ever been established. What remained certain, regardless of how the tapes were actually obtained, was their effect. Diana now understood, in the most visceral way possible, that nothing she said in what she believed was a private room could be assumed to stay private.
But I was actually crying out because I wanted to get better in order to go forward and continue my duty and my role as wife, mother, Princess of Wales. So, yes, I did inflict on myself. I didn't like myself. I was ashamed that I couldn't cope with the pressures.
What did you actually do?
Well, I just hurt my arms and my legs. And I work in environments now where I see women doing similar things, and I'm able to understand completely where they're coming from.
What was your husband's reaction to this when you began to injure yourself in this way?
But I didn't actually always do it in front of him. But obviously anyone who loves someone would be very concerned about it.
Hi viewers, before we go further, I want to ask you something. If you found out that a conversation you thought was completely private had been secretly recorded and then sold, piece by piece, to strangers who paid 36 pence a minute to listen in, would you ever fully trust anyone with a phone line again? Let me know in the comments, because what happens later in this story depends entirely on how deep that kind of fear can run once it's been proven justified. Diana was not the only one exposed. In December of 1989, just weeks before the Squidgygate recording, a separate and unrelated intercept captured a late-night phone call between then Prince Charles and Camilla Parker Bowles, both of them still married to other people at the time. That recording stayed hidden for 3 years before an Australian magazine published the full transcript in January of 1993. British newspapers followed within days. The call became infamous almost overnight, reduced in tabloid headlines to a crude joke about reincarnation that would follow Charles for the rest of his public life. Underneath the mockery, though, was something far more serious than a punchline. It was confirmation, in Charles's own recorded voice, of exactly what Diana had been telling her closest friends for years. She had not imagined the affair. She had not been paranoid or overreacting. She had been right, and now the entire country knew it standing right alongside her. 2 tapes. 2 betrayals. Neither one authorized, neither one anticipated, both of them proof, delivered publicly and undeniably, that Diana's fear of being watched was not the fragile imagination of an unstable woman. It was documented fact, repeated twice within a few years, by 2 entirely separate sets of eavesdroppers who had never coordinated with one another at all. By the time both tapes had run their course through the press, Diana had lived through a full public education in exactly how little privacy her position actually afforded her. She had learned, in the harshest way possible, that the walls of Kensington Palace were not the protection they appeared to be from the outside. She had learned that ordinary people with ordinary equipment could reach into the most private corners of her life and hand the contents over to a newspaper for a price. And she had learned, perhaps most importantly for what came next, that when something like this happened to her, the institution around her would not step in to shield her. It would simply wait for the story to move on. This was the emotional terrain Martin Bashir was about to walk into. Not a blank slate. Not an ordinary woman meeting an ordinary journalist. A princess who had already been proven right, twice, about being watched, and who had already learned that no one inside the palace walls was going to protect her from the next violation. This is the piece almost every retelling of this story leaves out. By the time anyone attempted to manipulate Diana using the language of surveillance and hidden betrayal, she had already lived through it, twice, for real, with no warning and absolutely no consent. Whoever came next would not need to convince her that spying was possible inside her own world. They would only need to convince her who was doing it to her this time. That is precisely where Martin Bashir entered the story. He did not arrive as a stranger making a cold approach. By the time he sat down across from Spenser in September of 1995, Bashir had already spent months cultivating a relationship with people in Diana's orbit, presenting himself as sympathetic, careful, and trustworthy, the rare journalist who seemed to understand the difference between coverage and exploitation. That reputation, real or carefully constructed, was itself a kind of currency. It made whatever he brought into a room feel more credible before a single document was even unfolded.
It's an explosive report, isn't it? Well, it clearly shows that Martin Bashir was dishonest, and it clearly shows that the BBC subsequent investigation was incompetent. And I think the BBC should think very seriously now about apologising to everyone who was hurt in this, and there are a lot of people on Princess Diana's side, a lot of people at the BBC. So I think they should think about that.
This is worth sitting with for a moment, because it explains something people often get wrong about manipulation at this level. It is rarely a single dramatic lie, delivered once, that does all the work. It is patience. Small deposits of trust, made over weeks and months, cashed in all at once at exactly the moment they are needed most. By September of 1995, Bashir had built enough credibility with the people around Diana that when he finally did produce something explosive, the instinct was not to question it. The instinct was to act on it immediately, because the person delivering it had already proven, again and again in smaller ways, that he could be trusted. In September of 1995, Bashir was a panorama journalist with ambition that had already begun to outpace his public profile. He wanted an interview no other journalist in Britain could get. He wanted Diana, directly, on camera, telling her own story in her own words for the first time. And he understood, correctly and cynically, that the fastest route to her was not through the palace's press office. It was through her brother. Spenser agreed to meet him. Bashir arrived carrying documents, laid them out with the calm authority of a man presenting settled fact. Bank statements, he explained, showing payments made to individuals close to Diana. Payments, he said, originating from a newspaper group, evidence that people she trusted inside her own household and inner circle were being compensated, quietly and continuously, to report on her private life back to the press. Spenser looked at those statements and felt the floor of his understanding shift beneath him. If they were genuine, it meant his sister's home was compromised from the inside, in a way even more invasive than the tape recorders had ever managed. It meant the people she saw every single day, the people she confided in over breakfast and trusted with her sons, might be selling details of her life piece by piece to the same newspapers that had already humiliated her twice. He had no way of knowing that those statements had been created only weeks earlier by a freelance graphic designer named Matt Weisler, working from Bashir's own specifications, and that Weisler believed the entire time he was doing nothing more than a modest personal favor for a BBC colleague. Weisler built the documents, handed them over, and went back to his ordinary freelance work, with no understanding of what they would ultimately be used to unlock. Spenser, holding what he believed to be hard, documented evidence of an active conspiracy against his own sister, made the decision he thought would protect her. He helped Bashir gain access to Diana herself. What Spenser could not have known, sitting in that room in September of 1995, was that the forged paper in his hands would do more than open a single conversation. It would help produce the most consequential 90 minutes of his sister's public life, an interview built, in part, on a foundation that existed only because one designer had done a favor whose true weight he never understood until it was far too late to take it back. Spenser arranged the meeting between Bashir and Diana himself, believing he was delivering a warning, not an introduction. He believed he was telling his sister the truth about a threat closing in around her, giving her the chance to defend herself publicly before her own trusted circle could do any more damage from the inside. He had no reason at the time to question the documents. They looked exactly like what they claimed to be. Official. Specific. corroborated by real names and real institutions, all of it manufactured by a graphic designer who had no idea what any of it would eventually be used for. There is a particular kind of manipulation that does not require the target to be foolish or careless. It requires only that the target trust the wrong person in a moment when trust feels like the only reasonable choice available. Spenser trusted a journalist who had already spent months building a relationship with him specifically in order to spend that trust at exactly the right moment. And when the moment came, it worked perfectly because it was never really designed to be questioned. It was designed to be believed. Every safeguard that should have caught this deception depended on one person, at one point in the chain, pausing to ask a harder question than the one they were being handed. Spenser didn't. The BBC's first internal reviews didn't, not thoroughly enough. It took 25 years and one designer's stubborn memory before anyone finally did. It is worth sitting with that a deception this consequential survived not because it was flawless, but because no one in a position to stop it early ever chose to look closely enough. But what happened next would not just change what the world knew about Diana's marriage. It would change what the world believed about her state of mind, her isolation, and her fear, not entirely for the reasons Bashir himself had planned or intended. The recording took place inside Kensington Palace, in Diana's own private sitting room, on the 5th of November, 1995. The camera equipment and sound gear were carried into the palace under the cover story that a new hi-fi system was being installed for the princess, a detail that would later become one of the most quietly chilling facts of the entire episode. No press. No palace communications staff. No senior aides in the room at all. Just Diana, Bashir, a single producer, and a cameraman gathered inside a sitting room that would later, in a strange twist of ordinary family life, become a playroom for her two young sons. Between the recording and the broadcast, the tape itself became something close to a state secret inside the BBC. According to accounts published later, the final transmission copy was kept under constant guard, with security personnel present throughout the editing process to make sure no early leak could reach the palace before the corporation was ready to air it. A small circle of senior editorial staff were briefed in the days leading up to broadcast, including the BBC's controller of editorial policy, who was tasked with weighing the enormous risk the interview carried against its historic value as a piece of journalism. 15 days passed in near total secrecy before it aired. On the 20th of November, 1995, at 9 o'clock in the evening, Panorama broadcast 54 minutes that would be watched by nearly 23 million people across the United Kingdom alone. Independent estimates place the worldwide audience at roughly 200 million people, across more than 100 countries. In Britain, the national grid recorded a surge in electricity demand of more than 1,000 megawatts in the minutes immediately following the broadcast, the physical, measurable result of millions of kettles switching on in millions of kitchens at the exact same moment. That is not a figure of speech. That is recorded infrastructure data, proof that an entire nation had, for 54 uninterrupted minutes, collectively stopped moving to listen. Diana spoke about her marriage with a candor no member of the royal family had ever offered publicly before her. She spoke about her own private struggles in years past. She acknowledged, in careful and deliberate language, the presence of a third person in her marriage, a reference the entire country immediately understood without needing it spelled out further, given everything that had already surfaced through the Camilla transcript 2 years earlier. She spoke about feeling isolated inside an institution that had, in her own words, never fully known what to do with someone like her, someone who felt too deeply and showed it too openly for an establishment built around composure and restraint. Every newspaper in the country the next morning treated it as the interview of a generation. Front pages were rebuilt overnight to make room for it. The BBC treated it the same way internally, circulating congratulations, planning award submissions before the ink on the reviews had even dried. Bashir, virtually unknown before that November evening, became almost overnight one of the most celebrated investigative journalists working anywhere in British television. Offers began arriving from other broadcasters within weeks. His name, attached to hers, had become instantly, permanently valuable. In pubs across the country, the usual Monday evening noise fell away as the broadcast played. Conversations paused mid-sentence. Regulars who had been mid-pour at the bar stopped to watch the screen mounted in the corner, pints left half-finished and forgotten. It was the kind of collective national moment that television could still produce in 1995, before streaming and social media had scattered audiences into 1,000 smaller rooms. Everyone, more or less, was watching the same 54 minutes at the same time. Somewhere in an ordinary home in the United Kingdom that same night, a freelance graphic designer sat in front of his own television, watching the broadcast like everyone else, and felt something cold settle low in his stomach. Matt Weisler recognized his own work. The financial documents referenced in the reporting that surrounded the interview, the very same ones that had convinced Spenser months earlier, that had helped ease open Diana's door, were built from design templates he had created himself, believing at the time they would never be seen by anyone beyond a private conversation between colleagues. He raised his concerns with the BBC almost immediately, within days of the broadcast, describing plainly what he had built and what he now suspected it had actually been used to accomplish. The BBC investigated. Briefly, internally, with limited scope, led by a small group of senior news executives who would later be criticised, decades on, for the narrowness of what they chose to examine. Weisler was interviewed. His account was recorded. And then, according to the findings released decades later, the matter was allowed to quietly go cold, filed away rather than escalated, treated as a loose end rather than what it actually was, evidence of a serious deception at the heart of the corporation's biggest story of the decade. Weisler would not work with the corporation again for a long stretch of years afterward. He had done what he believed, at the time, was the right thing, coming forward voluntarily with information that could only damage his own professional relationships. Instead of being protected for that honesty, he found himself quietly frozen out, watching from a distance as the man he had unknowingly helped deceive an entire nation continued climbing. Bashir, meanwhile, went on to build a celebrated career on both sides of the Atlantic, eventually working for major American networks. And the forged documents that had started the entire chain of events sat, undisturbed, buried inside BBC internal records for the next 25 years, waiting for someone with the standing, the persistence, and the legal resources to force them back out into the light. Diana herself never fully understood how the interview had truly come together behind the scenes. In a private note she wrote afterward, later published as part of a formal inquiry decades later, she stated plainly that Bashir had not personally shown her any documents himself, and had not given her information she did not already possess through other means. Which raises the exact question that would take a full quarter of a century to properly answer. If Diana herself never saw the forged evidence directly, how far into the palace, and into her own family, had the deception actually traveled before it ever touched her? The answer, it would turn out, was that it didn't need to reach her directly at all. It only needed to reach the people responsible for protecting her, and convince them first. Diana had just handed the world the single most consequential interview of her life, built in part on a foundation she herself never even laid eyes on. And the true cost of that interview was only just beginning to accumulate. By August of 1996, Diana and Charles' divorce was formally finalized after a prolonged and often bitter series of private negotiations. The terms were extensively reported at the time and have been confirmed repeatedly since. A lump sum settlement believed to total around $22.5 million, along with an additional annual allowance intended to help cover the running costs of her private office. She kept her apartments inside Kensington Palace. She retained a formal shared custody arrangement for her 2 sons, something she had fought hard to secure throughout the negotiations. But the settlement took from her something no amount of money could ever restore: her formal style as Her Royal Highness. Buckingham Palace insisted the title be removed as a condition of the divorce, reportedly over Diana's own initial and strenuous objections, and even over the Queen's own private preference, according to multiple accounts, to allow her to keep it. Charles, by most contemporaneous reporting, was firm that the title come off entirely. In strict practical terms, it meant that whenever Diana appeared alongside other titled members of the royal family, formal protocol technically required her to curtsy, even, eventually, to her own sons, once they grew into their adult royal roles. She later told friends, and it was widely reported at the time, that William had reassured her the title meant nothing to him personally. She would always be his mother, regardless of what the palace chose to call her. It became one of the few genuine comforts available to her in a fight she had ultimately lost. Diana adjusted to her new circumstances the way she had adjusted to nearly everything else the institution had handed her, in public, with visible composure, and in private, according to those closest to her, with considerably more difficulty. She stepped back from patronage of a number of charities, explaining in a formal statement that the change in her status made it appropriate for those organizations to find a new royal patron going forward. It was a diplomatic way of describing a demotion she had never asked for and had fought, unsuccessfully, to prevent. She moved her office out of St. James's Palace and set up a new base at Kensington Palace instead, continuing her charitable work largely on her own terms, without the formal royal backing that had once opened doors for her automatically. Landmine clearance. HIV and AIDS awareness, at a time when public stigma around the disease remained severe. Homelessness. She threw herself into the causes she cared about with the same intensity she had always shown, title or no title, and in many ways, freed from some of the palace's more rigid expectations, she found a version of public life that suited her better than the one she was leaving behind. There is a version of this story where the loss of the Her Royal Highness title reads as a simple institutional cruelty, a petty stripping of status inflicted on a woman who had already given the monarchy everything it had asked of her. And in some ways, that reading holds up. But the more complicated truth is that Diana used the years immediately following her divorce to become, in the eyes of much of the public, more effective and more beloved than she had ever been while formally tethered to the institution's rules. The photographs of her walking through an active minefield in Angola in January of 1997, without royal protocol dictating every step, did more to advance the international campaign against landmines than a decade of formal royal engagements might have managed. She had lost a title. She had not lost her ability to command a room, a headline, or a cause. None of which changes what came next. The freedom she found in those final months existed alongside the very real, very physical vulnerability created by the loss of her security detail, two consequences of the same decision, pulling in opposite directions, one expanding her influence and the other narrowing her protection, both arriving from the identical stroke of a pen in August of 1996. The loss that would matter far more than any formal title, though, was quieter, and its full weight would not become entirely clear until almost exactly a year later. Alongside the change in her royal status came the removal of her permanent, dedicated police protection detail, the officers who had accompanied her for years and who understood, better than any journalist, any palace official, or any newspaper editor, exactly how to manage the very real physical danger that came with being the most relentlessly photographed woman on the planet. On the 31st of August, 1997, Diana died in a car crash inside the Pont de l'Alma tunnel in Paris, riding in a vehicle being aggressively pursued by photographers on motorcycles, without the trained security detail that had once accompanied her virtually everywhere she went. Reporting in the years since has repeatedly noted what many close to the situation believed at the time, and have continued to believe since. That the protection she lost as part of her divorce settlement might have fundamentally changed the circumstances of that night, had it still been in place. In the immediate years before her death, Diana had grown accustomed to navigating public life largely on her own terms, without the formal protection detail that had once managed the crowds and the photographers that followed her everywhere. Friends and biographers who spoke with her during this period described a woman who had adapted, out of necessity, to a level of personal risk that would have been considered unthinkable just a few years earlier, when her every public movement was coordinated by trained officers who understood exactly how to manage a crowd of press before it became dangerous. That expertise, built over years of specialized training, simply was not present in the vehicle that left the Ritz Hotel in Paris on the night of the 31st of August. None of this is to suggest a single clean line of cause and effect between a forged bank statement in 1995 and a car crash 2 years later. The full picture was always more complicated than that, involving decisions made by multiple people across multiple institutions, French investigators, British inquests, and years of subsequent review. But the documented sequence of events remains what it remains. An interview secured through deception in 1995. A divorce, and the loss of a security detail in 1996. a fatal crash without that detail in place in 1997. Each link in that chain is independently verified. What they add up to, together, is a question that has never fully gone away. The forged documents that had helped produce the interview, which reshaped how the entire world understood her marriage, were, by this point, buried deep inside BBC internal records that almost no one outside the corporation even knew existed. Whistler's early warning, offered voluntarily within days of the original broadcast, had gone essentially nowhere. The one man capable of proving the deception had already tried to speak up once, immediately, and had simply been allowed to fade into silence. Diana was gone. And the full truth about how her most famous, most consequential interview had actually come together died, for the next 25 years, quietly alongside her. Her funeral, on the 6th of September, 1997, drew crowds estimated in the millions along the streets of London, and a global television audience that dwarfed even the numbers Panorama had achieved less than 2 years earlier. Charles Spenser stood and delivered a eulogy that did not shy away from criticism of the press, describing his sister as the most hunted person of the modern age. Among the family walking behind her coffin that morning were her 2 sons, William not yet 15 and Harry just 12, both of them stepping through a moment no child should ever have to walk through in full public view. It's worth pausing here, because it matters. The next part of this story is about institutions, documents, and inquiries. But underneath all of it are 2 young boys who lost their mother a year after she lost the protection that might have kept her safe, and a brother who spent the next 25 years unable to fully let go of a meeting he'd once believed was helping her. Everything from here forward happened in the shadow of that loss. It would take a full quarter of a century, a hard-fought freedom of information request, and one brother's stubborn refusal to let the question rest, before the world finally learned what had actually happened inside that BBC building back in the autumn of 1995. By 2020, Charles Spenser had never fully let go of the quiet discomfort he had carried since that original meeting with Bashir, 25 years earlier. When new reporting began to resurface old questions about exactly how the interview had originally been secured, Spenser pushed, formally, publicly, and repeatedly, for the BBC to finally answer for what he himself had personally experienced in that room. The corporation, facing mounting public pressure it could no longer easily deflect, commissioned an independent inquiry, led by a former Justice of the UK Supreme Court, Lord John Dyson. Dyson's investigation was thorough in a way the BBC's original, hurried 1996 internal review had never come close to being. It examined internal correspondence stretching back a quarter of a century. It formally interviewed the people directly involved, including, this time, Spenser himself, whose complete absence from the original 1996 investigation the Dyson report specifically and pointedly identified as a serious institutional failing. It traced the origin of the forged bank statements directly back to Matt Whistler's original design work from 1995, and it established, definitively and on the record, that Bashir had personally commissioned the forgeries with the specific intent of deceiving Spenser and securing his trust as a gateway to Diana. The inquiry also examined how Bashir had behaved once questions first began circulating in the months after the broadcast. The report's conclusion was blunt. Bashir had lied, repeatedly, and maintained those lies for as long as he believed he could get away with it, only shifting his account once continuing to deny the forgeries was no longer sustainable against the paper trail investigators had assembled. It was not a single lapse in judgment. It was a sustained, deliberate pattern, stretched out across years, that the original internal review had simply failed to catch, or had chosen not to look hard enough to find. Members of Parliament weighed in publicly once the findings were released, several of them directly criticising the BBC's decision, years after the original interview, to rehire Bashir for a senior role at the corporation despite the doubts that had already surfaced internally about his conduct. The rehiring, one committee member noted during a public hearing into the affair, seemed to stretch credibility to its breaking point, given what senior BBC leadership already privately understood about the questions hanging over him. That rehiring decision deserves a moment of its own attention, because it is arguably the most damning detail in the entire 25-year story. It was not simply that the BBC failed to catch the deception in 1995. It was that, years later, with internal doubts about Bashir already documented and known to senior leadership, the corporation chose to bring him back anyway, placing him in a position of renewed trust and visibility. A former Director General later admitted publicly that the original decision to trust Bashir's honesty had been the product of, in his words, wrong judgment, and that the institution's confidence in him had been abused and misplaced. It is one thing to be deceived once. It is another to be shown evidence of the deception and choose, deliberately, to look away from it a second time. The findings, released publicly in May of 2021, did not soften the language in the slightest. Bashir was described in the report as dishonest, as devious, as having acted in serious breach of the BBC's own internal editorial standards and guidelines. The report concluded, unambiguously, that the corporation's original 1996 investigation had fallen well short of the standards of integrity and transparency the BBC had always publicly claimed to represent, and had, in practical effect, protected Bashir rather than holding him properly accountable at the time. Tim Davie, the BBC's Director General, issued a formal, personal apology to Spenser. The corporation confirmed publicly that the 1995 interview would never be broadcast again in any form, by the BBC or by any other outlet under license, permanently. The apology extended beyond Spenser alone. In the months that followed, the corporation also apologized formally, in a separate legal settlement, to a former royal household nanny who had been the subject of unfounded rumors that surfaced in connection with the original interview and its fallout, rumors that had never been substantiated and had caused her lasting personal harm. The BBC agreed to pay her damages believed to be in the region of £200,000, a quiet but significant acknowledgement that the damage caused by the deception had rippled out far beyond the two people, Diana and Spenser, most directly involved in the original meeting.